So today I'm here to talk to you about alcohol, drugs, and us as Adventists. What do we need to know? So who am I to actually be able to talk to you about that? At the age of 18, I have absolutely no doubt that God put me in a position to be a journalist, something I'd be interested in for a long time. But you don't get into journalism the way I got in. So even back then, I had a very strong sense that I'd been placed there. But fast forward 8 years, and I found myself sitting in a central sub-editing desk on a bunch of community newspapers. And I was bored. I was ready for the next challenge. I was helping pump out 15 newspapers a week, and it was time to move on. Once again, God stepped in. An ad in a newspaper that I never usually read, I happened to fall upon. It was to be the editor of a magazine that serviced New South Wales at that time and later national. New South Wales drug and alcohol workforce. These are the people who work with drug problems. The health workers, the police, judges, anybody who somehow comes across drugs in their work. And I was being asked to go and edit a magazine that would help them. And over time, I did that job for a few years, and it was a huge learning curve. And over time, I took time out to have children, and then once again, phone calls came out of the blue. I thought I was done with drugs. I'd done that, moved on. Phone calls came out of the blue. And lo and behold, I found myself as the editor of a second magazine, which had a readership of 79,000 people who work with drug and alcohol problems in Australia. Now, for me, I was raised as an Adventist. My mother became an Adventist when I was 4. I went through Adventist schools for most of my school educational career. I didn't know much about drugs. I knew a little bit about alcohol. You see, I might have been raised an Adventist, but my family is not Adventist. And we have a very diverse family with very diverse drinking habits. So any family celebration for us will be teetotalers, somebody who has a glass or two of wine, and heavy drinkers. So I got to see a little bit of that. But it also got to challenge some of what I was hearing in my Adventist school and in my Adventist church. The message I was getting was, drugs are bad for you. Don't go there, don't use them, you're on the path to ruin. So I had to balance that with, hey, I see people around me have a glass or two of wine. I don't see them going down that path. And that's not a dilemma that's common just to me. I know many of our young people will face the same dilemma. I'm told that drugs are really bad for me, but occasionally I see a friend take a drug and, they don't fall down dead. So that was something I had to balance. But coming into a job as an editor of a magazine that serviced our Australian drug and alcohol workforce, my journalistic training meant that I had to put aside all my preconceived ideas, what I thought about drugs. And I had to use my journalistic training just to look at it from what are the facts about drugs. And over that time, I started as a teetotaler. Over that time, my understanding of drugs matured and changed, and today I'm still a teetotaler, but I've made those choices for often quite different reasons. But firstly, as an Adventist, this is something that we often don't like to talk about. We think that if we give our kids a good, healthy lifestyle, if we're good role models, hopefully we'll avoid the whole drug question. We'll fill their lives with so much good stuff, they won't need to think about drugs. And so therefore, we won't need to think about it. So what is a drug? Hello, there it is, whoops. Okay, a drug is a chemical or organic substance that's used to treat a medical or psychological condition. And such a substance can also be used illegally to alter consciousness or mood. So the drugs that we're talking about are things that change the way we think and behave, our perceptions and moods and behaviours. Now, when I surveyed lots of people, I want to particularly thank our young people who were very willing to tell me about their experiences, what they knew about drugs, what they'd seen, what they'd like to know about. I also talked to parents who told me that what they'd like to hear about. So we may be in for a long session today, guys. But I particularly want to thank our young people who were so open and honest with me. Thank you. Now, some of the parents said to me, tell us about all the drugs, tell us what they do. I could spend all day and tomorrow telling you about, these are just some of the drugs. And every day, new drugs are created, new drugs are made. So we're not going to go there today. What we are going to go to, I'm going to talk about a few of the key drugs of concern, or at least I'll highlight what are the key drugs of concern in our community. Alcohol is our number one drug of concern. Alcohol causes the most harm within our society. And people often don't think alcohol is a drug. They think alcohol, drugs. Alcohol is a drug and it's our number one. I'm not going to talk much about tobacco today. The messages about tobacco are fairly clear, and tobacco use is actually falling significantly within our community. I think particularly our young people are aware of the problems that arise from tobacco use. Prescription drugs is another area of growing concern in Australia. It's not something we tend to think about as drugs. Doctor prescribes us something, and I'm certainly not about to say, don't take prescription drugs. But there are particular harms associated with prescription drugs. And then we come to the illicit drugs. Cannabis, also known as marijuana, is our most common illicit drug. And then you'll hear lots of headlines about ice. You know, that's the big sensational one in the media at the moment. Ice, the ice epidemic. Everybody's doing ice. They're not actually. And then there's heroin. That was a big problem some years ago. Not quite so much now. And also another one that our young people mentioned to me that they'd like to hear about is ecstasy, the party drugs, the synthetic drugs. So I'll spend a few minutes on them as well. But firstly, what are some of the problems that arise from drugs? There are health problems, crime, road accidents, suicide. Drugs and alcohol contribute a lot to suicide, homicide and other forms of early death. Domestic violence is a big one. Alcohol in particular has a massive impact on the domestic violence and family breakdown in our community. And another one is lost work productivity. Well, I'm sure this audience doesn't tend to have the problem. Lost work productivity is one of the biggest costs to our society. People who don't feel well enough after a big night out to work well the next day or don't turn up for work. And of course, street violence. Just this week we saw 2 young men appear in court, sentenced because they'd been involved in one-punch knockouts down in King's Cross. One of those men will spend the next 7 years in jail. He didn't anticipate that a night of alcohol would end up him being behind bars for many years. And that's just a graphic that shows some of the cost to our society. And this is just Australia. Alcohol alone, without any other drugs, costs Australia $15 billion in lost revenue each year. Do we have a deficit problem? Maybe we need to look here. As you'll see, one of the greatest costs, 42% of that $15 billion is lost productivity. So it is a big problem for our community. Alcohol puts 430 Australians in hospital every single day. This might not be just because I had a drink last night, but this could be the cancer or the cardiovascular disease or some other thing that has happened to me as a result of alcohol use. And it kills 15 Australians every single day of the year. But first, we're a people of the Word. We say that we come from the Bible. What does the Bible have to say about alcohol and drugs? Let's take a moment. Firstly, the Bible says virtually nothing about the drugs that we know as illicit drugs. So cannabis, marijuana, ecstasy, all those illicits really don't get much of a mention. There are a couple of words in there that there is some debate whether it's referring to drugs. But we don't really know, and I'm certainly not brave enough to make a stand on what those words say. However, there is one drug that the Bible does have a lot to say about. And we need to look at that, and we also need to draw out the principles from that, what it has to say about that drug, and apply it to all similar psychoactive substances. And that is alcohol. The Bible has a lot to say about alcohol. If you read an English translation of the Bible, and it'll depend which version you read, wine will get a mention more than 220 times, while strong drink will get a mention approximately 20 times. And if you take it back further and go back to the original Hebrew and the Greek, you'll find that there are several words used in the Bible for wine. But there's two predominant words that get a mention. In the Hebrew, it's yayin. In the Greek, it's oinos. And I apologise to any linguists out there, I probably didn't say them correctly. But we've got a problem with these two words. Both yayin and oinos refer to grape juice, of the alcoholic variety and the non-alcoholic variety. And in this point, and I'd like to encourage you to study the Bible on this because it's a fascinating study. In this point, I have found that depending on your interpretation of these words, the way you interpret the Bible's advice will greatly impact the way you understand the Bible. If you believe that yayin mostly refers to non-alcoholic grape juice, you'll read the Bible quite differently than if those commentators who read it referring to a mostly alcoholic grape juice. So what are the clear messages in the Bible? There are a number of stories, and I'm not going to talk about anything today where we're not quite sure whether we're talking alcoholic or non-alcoholic. There are a number of stories in the Bible where it clearly involves alcohol. And it's quite clear that alcohol was available enough to the early Hebrews that they understood what it was about. There's Lot and his daughters. His daughters got Lot drunk so that they could become pregnant. Noah got drunk on the produce of his vineyard and exposed himself. Hannah was so upset when she was praying that the priest Eli thought that she was drunk. And Absalom suggested getting one of the generals, Abner, drunk so that he could be killed. And of course, David gets Uriah drunk in the hope that he will go home and visit his wife, Bathsheba, so that Bathsheba's pregnancy could be attributed to Uriah rather than to David himself. So there's no shortage of stories involving, obviously, alcoholic substances. And of course, the drunken Persian king Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to appear before his guests naked. Another alcoholic story. But are we talking about the same drink? The alcohol in the Bible, confirmed by historians, is considered to have been about 2 to 5% in concentration. But where does that place us against today's alcohol? I've got a few drinks that are common in today's society. So we're looking at a biblical wine that is 2 to 5% in concentration. This is the amount of alcohol in your glass. Today's beer, as you can see, there's a whole range from a low end up to a very high end where their hard liquor is 20 to 70% proof in alcohol. So we're looking at biblical wines that were about the strength of today's low-strength beers. So just to place you in what the Bible says and where modern-day things are. So what's the message of the Bible? There is no, whatever your view on yayin and oinos and how much alcohol they apply to, there's one message that no Bible scholar will disagree with. And that is Ephesians 5:18. Don't get drunk with wine because it makes you lose control. Instead, keep on being filled with the Spirit. Again, in Proverbs, there's lots of advice, particularly in the Proverbs, about how we are to treat wine and liquor. Wine gives false courage. Hard liquor leads to brawls. What fools men are to let it master them, making them reel drunkenly down the street. So and there's further instruction that's given to kings, leaders, the Nazarites, elders, deacons and priests on the importance of avoiding drinking, either in their lifestyle or specific aspects of their work. So the message is we are to retain clear minds and should avoid drunkenness. And in the absence of any message about or in today's language, don't get blind, pissed, tipsy, blotto, plastered, high, stoned, or off your face. And there's probably a few other words that you guys can think of. And in the absence of any direct biblical comment on other drugs, we need to apply this principle to any substances that have mind-altering properties. So that's what the Bible has to say. And of course, if you're an Adventist, you will have grown up with this text. This is the number one text that we refer to when we talk about looking after our bodies and what we take into them. Don't you realise that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who lives in you and was given to you by God? You do not belong to yourself, for God bought you with a high price, so you must honour God with your body. And so one of the key reasons that we're given for retaining control of our senses is that we are to live to God and to prepare for his return. But what is drunkenness? Now, if you're not an experienced drinker, and certainly this has been my understanding growing up in the Adventist church, you will think, drink, drunk, one glass, make me drunk. If you've had a bit more experience with alcohol or other drugs, you'll know that it is a difficult line. It's not quite that simple. Alcohol or any other drug will impact on you in different ways depending who you are. If you're a woman, if you haven't got any experience with alcohol or drugs, if you haven't eaten, alcohol will impact you much faster than if you're a big, solid man who's been a seasoned drinker. So it varies according to the individual. But what does it actually mean to be drunk? The dictionary... hang on, what have I done? I've gone somewhere. Hang on, I've just got to find where I am. Somehow I've gone back. Oops. Yep. Having a slight problem here. So yes, it will impact us in different ways depending on who we are. But to be drunk means to be intoxicated to the extent of losing control of normal physical and mental functions. Now, on our roads, where our authorities have tried to give us a limit, if you're a professional or a new driver, you're required to have a 0 blood alcohol content to be on the road. If you're a longer-term driver, there's a maximum legal blood alcohol concentration of 0.05. So, where did these figures come from? If alcohol or other drugs impact us all differently, how did they come up with these figures? This is an interesting chart, and this will show that the impact of any drug, or in this case alcohol, begins. It's a gradual building up effect. If you've had just 0.02% blood alcohol level, which is not a lot of alcohol to get you to that point, you'll begin to experience a reduction in your ability to perceive things, to make judgments. And when you reach the legal driving limit of 0.05, you're twice as likely to have a crash than if you hadn't had any drink at all. And if you go back when I was growing up, the legal limit used to be 0.08, a little bit higher. It's a bit scary that at 0.08, you're 5 times more likely to have a crash than before you started drinking. It's a bit scary, isn't it? But who uses drugs? What's a drug user look like? There's often a very stereotypical image. You know, we think a drug user looks like. They're probably malnourished, might have a bad background, not necessarily holding down a job. You know, there's certainly people who use drugs who fall into that category. But I want you to pick the drug user. Who's a drug user in this picture? Do you think it's the guy with the dreadlocks in the middle? This guy here? Wouldn't be this lovely old lady down here, would it? Or this guy up here? Or this girl here looks a bit too studious, do you think? Doesn't fit the stereotype? Guess what? I've got no idea who's a drug user in that picture. And I challenge you to try and work it out. They may all be drug users. They may not. I've got no idea. Drug users, people who use drugs come in all shapes and sizes. They may hold down good jobs. They may be very functional people. They may be some of our leaders. They may also be people who are struggling and suffering difficult backgrounds, people who are on the street. Drug use is across society. But at the same time, so I just want to break it down a little more. Every 3 years there's a major survey. 23,000 Australians are asked about their drinking and drug using habits. This last one was done in 2013. As you'll see, 7% of Australians drink on a daily basis. A bit more than a third of our population, 37%, say they drink on a weekly basis. And then there's a very large chunk of the population, another third of the population, who say that they are occasional drinkers. This is in the last 12 months. Say that they drink on a less than weekly basis. And then we've got a group up here of ex-drinkers, and 14% of Australians over the age of 14 say that they've never had a full serve of alcohol. So not everybody's drinking as much as the media would like us to have us think they are. And that's an important message, particularly for our young people, to know that not everybody is doing it. So if we break that down even further, 21% of Australians over the age of 14 have never drunk or no longer drink. And then there's another big group here who drink on an occasional basis. Now, I can't tell you what that occasional basis looks like. Maybe they are heavy drinkers once a fortnight. Maybe they're someone who has a sip of glass of wine at a birthday party or a social occasion. Can't tell you, but they're people who identify as not using a lot of alcohol regularly. So not everybody is doing it. Now, if we flip over to the illicit drugs, same survey. This is the number of Australians who report using some of the major illicit drugs. I won't go into all of them, but as you can see, most occasions less than 3% of people, and even less than 2% of people, report using some of the drugs that are particularly sensationalised in Australian media. The only illicit drug that gains a lot of traction is cannabis or marijuana. 10% of the Australian population reports using cannabis in the last 12 months. But this is a particularly important message to our young people who, when you go out, you'll often face a situation of everybody's doing it, come on, be part of the crowd. The flip side is that these are the Australians who don't use illicit drugs. It's worth keeping that in mind next time your mate says, come on, have a try. Most people aren't doing it. And then, to show the teens, this is what one survey reports. 40% of teens say they've had a full serve of alcohol between the ages 12 and 17. 60% of teens haven't. Once again, 15% of teens have tried cannabis or dope. Most haven't. And once again, not every teen is doing drugs. But let's look at another class of drugs, the pharmaceutical drugs. Here's our friend the doctor, and somebody has very satirically put him as a drug pusher. Now, my apologies to all doctors out there. I don't believe that you shouldn't be prescribing drugs. But this is an important category that we need to look to as a community, and something that us as Adventists will be affected by. We've all needed to go and get medications. And what's wrong with that? Now, saying that major survey I talked about, this is the number of people. OTC stands for over the counter. So a medication that you might go and buy from a chemist or in Coles, a painkiller, or something the doctors prescribe to kill pain. More than 60% of Australians have used in the last 12 months. And you'll see that as we get older, our use of painkillers increases markedly. The older you are, often the more chronic conditions and pain you have and things you need to medicate. But is this a problem? Don't we all have a headache occasionally and need something? I'm not saying don't take your headache tablet. But it's more of a problem than we as a society actually realise. Fatal overdoses caused by prescription drugs outnumber deaths from illegal drugs considerably, and the figure is rising. Now, you'll get the impression sometimes that, these fatal overdoses from prescription drugs, they must be drug users who can't get their drug of choice, so they're going and knocking off little old ladies for their painkiller. Occasionally that happens. Reality is most of the time they're not the people who are dying from fatal drug overdoses. Most of these deaths were unintentional. You'll all be familiar with Heath Ledger's death a few years ago. Very much an unintentional death caused by taking a cocktail of pharmaceutical drugs. It's something that we need to be aware of, and particularly be aware of with our children, that, when should we tell our children about drugs? Tell your children when you start taking drugs, and that's the headache tablet or the painkiller you give them in the morning. All opportunities to talk to our kids about what we put into our bodies and the impact it can have. My mother is one of God's saints, and she'll always say to me, "But Jenny, I don't understand. Why would people want to use drugs?" There's lots of reasons. But I found this funny little picture, and I thought that's a good one. People like to think that, alcohol will relax me, I'll be a little bit cooler, I'll be able to relate better. But dear alcohol, we had a deal where you would make me funnier, smarter, and a better dancer. I saw the video. We need to talk. So it does alter our perceptions of ourselves. But why do people use drugs? The first three in this list are particularly relevant, particularly to our teenagers. There's a lot of peer pressure. The teen years are years when you start to go out to parties, start to mix without your parents, and particularly, it's not like, even in our Adventist school, we like to think, the kids are a bit protected from drugs. The reality is they're there. And in our public schools, we know that they will see drug use. So they might take it for social or peer pressure. Your mates all seem to be doing it, so I'll do it too. Or I'm a bit curious, Mum and Dad have always said, don't do drugs, they're really bad for you, but, I just want to try it. Or I want to take a risk, Risk-taking behaviours aren't limited to drugs. The teens are a time of risk-taking behaviour. How many young people involved in extreme sports or love to go really fast, drive a fast car, get on that mountain bike, take it down as hard as you can. There's lots of risk-taking behaviours. And of course, pleasure. One of the ways that drugs interact with our body is they affect the chemicals in the brain that are the pleasure centre. So they generate lots of the good chemicals that make us feel good, just like other fun activities do. If you enjoy shopping or outdoor sports or other things, those same chemicals are being triggered in the brain. Now, how many of you actually got up this morning and said, I can't function unless I have my coffee? It certainly happens. You were taking a performance-enhancing drug. Performance-enhancing drugs don't just belong to athletes who want to do better at sports. Or if you're a student and think you better take something just to help you study a little bit harder, a little bit longer, that's a performance-enhancing drug. Lots of people like to use drugs as a way of escape. I've got a problem, I've had a stressful day. Nice to just chill out for a little while and put my problems to the side. That's another reason why people do turn to drugs. And of course, pain relief. And that might be physical pain, or it could be psychological pain. And we know that people who often develop problems with drugs, it's about the pain relief of psychological pain, that they've experienced trauma or dislocation from their community in some way or their family in some way. And often they turn to drugs to ease the psychological pain. And of course, that's one way. We all have problems. Sometimes it's easier to avoid the problem. But how do drugs actually work in us? How do drugs work with the brain? The brain is our control centre, so they have a direct impact on the brain. Now, when you start looking at brain stuff, it gets really complex and hard to understand. So this is a little graphic that tries to keep it really simple. As people, we'll communicate one to each other, and our words will be the communication between us. The brain works in a similar way. One brain cell talks to the other brain cell through the release of neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters can be responsible for all sorts of things. They might be about the adrenaline we need. We see a scary situation, so brain cell says to the other, adrenaline, got to rush away, got to take flight. Or they could be dopamine, which is about pleasure. Dopamine is the chemical in our brain that makes us feel and be aware of pleasure. Now, if you're using drugs, it's these neurotransmitters, the communication paths between the brain cells, that will be affected. Some drugs might slow those things down. You'll find that the messages are very convoluted, they move slowly, so you don't function quite as well as you could. Other drugs, particularly stimulant drugs like amphetamine, ice, these stimulant drugs can make lots of neurotransmitters enact. So instead of getting the regular amount, you're suddenly getting lots of these neurotransmitters wanting to talk to the other things. So it increases the feeling of pleasure or whatever that neurotransmitter's job is to do. So that's how it works. But an interesting fact is, and it's only something that's been started to be discovered in recent years, they used to think that once upon a time, by the time we were about 18, we were done with development. We'd matured from babies, we were now young adults. We had reached adulthood. What they have discovered is that our brains continue to develop until we're at least in our mid-20s. And in some studies are actually showing that particularly for men, the brain development continues up until their 30s. And during the teenage years, yes, you're still developing, guys. During the teenage years, the brain's job is that it's refining the neural pathways. So what you are doing as a teenager is reinforcing the pathways you will use in your brain throughout your adulthood. And one of the greatest problems is that these pathways can be permanently affected by the use of alcohol and drugs. And I want to show you a slide of a teenage brain. The top slide is of a teenage 15-year-old who is a non-drinker. All the bits of pink and orange show where lots of brain activity is happening. The slide below is a much unhealthier brain, 15-year-old heavy drinker. As you can see, not a lot of activity is occurring in this teenage brain, nowhere near as much as should happen in the unaffected brain. And unfortunately, some of that damage will last well into adulthood, and maybe there permanently. And another slide of brains. These are adult brains. The top row is the adult brains of non-drinkers or people who use alcohol, don't have an dependence on alcohol. As you can see, fairly full brains, not too many gaps. The bottom row is people who've been long-term heavy drinkers, people who experience an alcohol addiction. As you can see, there's some really big holes, particularly in the frontal quarters and then in the middle. These brains have been permanently affected by alcohol use. Now, I've picked on alcohol this morning. Drug use is very similar in its effect. Unfortunately, it's a bit harder to study some of the drug use because these drugs are illicit, so our researchers have to jump a lot of hoops to be able to study illicit drug use and its impact on us. But what about our health? We've talked about the brain. How does alcohol impact our health? Now, this is a really busy slide, and I don't expect you to understand it all. But each of these little graphs represents one disease that is affected by alcohol. Alcohol increases our risk of developing lots of different conditions, whether it be cancer or liver problems, heart problems, etc. Now, along the bottom, we have the amount of alcohol. Now, this is a British slide. It talks about 10 units, 20 units, 30 units. The equivalent in Australia, 10 units of alcohol is one standard drink, which is 10 milligrams of alcohol. That's what we would call it. So every 10 is one standard drink. And a standard drink, if you had a glass of wine, standard drink would probably take up less than half of that glass, depending on the size of your glass. Now, if you've been with people who like to drink and want you to drink, they'll say, come on, it's good for your heart. Alcohol helps your heart. It'll reduce your risk of getting heart disease. And it's true. There are studies that show that alcohol does reduce your risk. This is the one we're talking about. This is the particular slide where we look at alcohol's impact on heart disease. Now, if you're a male, and a little bit of alcohol reduces your risk of getting heart disease. Very, very slightly. But when you go back to how much alcohol are we talking about, we're talking about, this only measures 8 glasses or eight standard drinks a week. That's not a lot of alcohol. To achieve this effect, you would need to drink a little tiny bit in the bottom of a wine glass. And given all these other risk factors that alcohol is increasing, it's probably not a good idea to start drinking alcohol just to make your heart a little bit safer. There's just too many other risks to it. Now, when I talk to our young people, they told me drugs that they would particularly like to hear about. So I'm going to look at just a couple of the drugs that they're most likely to come across, and some of them have told me they do come across them as they move in their social circles. Cannabis, 10% of the Australian population have used cannabis in the last 12 months. It's illegal. It's our most popular illegal drug. These are the sorts of effects that cannabis will have on you. When you take a small dose, you may feel less inhibited, more relaxed. You may find things immensely funny, things that everybody else doesn't find so funny. You might become quiet and reflective, but the more you use, the greater amounts and more regularly, these other effects are things that will start to cut in. And over long term, the brain, the lungs, the hormones, our immune systems, and our mental health are the areas that suffer most from long-term cannabis use. And there's been long debates about, does cannabis cause schizophrenia? Long debates in the research community. The evidence is coming in that while cannabis doesn't cause schizophrenia, if you have a predisposition towards a mental illness such as schizophrenia, cannabis is likely to be the trigger that can make it happen. So yes, definitely not the drug to take if you've got mental health issues. Then ice. This is the big one at the moment. All the headlines talk about the ice epidemic, how Australia is just awash with ice. There has been a big change in our amphetamine market in the last 10 years. Ice is now the most commonly used amphetamine, or speed, you may know it as speed. Ice is the most pure form, and that's why we're having so many problems. And I was talking to an outreach worker in a small country town recently who rang me and said, have you got any resources about ice? Can you tell me how to work with ice? And she was telling me that a lot of people who have been using drugs in her town are now using ice rather than the other drugs. And she said, this is because it's the only thing being sold. The people who used to sell cannabis are no longer carrying cannabis, they're just carrying ice. So, ice, cannabis, very different effects, but if you want to take drugs, often you'll use whatever's available. So this is one of the reasons that ice is being seen as a particularly big problem in our community. And I know, talking to local youth workers here on the coast, they say while they may not see as much of ice, but they're certainly hearing about it amongst the young people that they work with. So ice will increase feelings of pleasure and confidence, but it will also cause a lot of problems with connection. And our emergency hospital departments are currently seeing more than their fair share of ice use. If you go to an emergency department worker, they'll talk about ice and they'll just go, no, because these are the patients that they're seeing coming in psychotic episodes, often very violent, require a lot of emergency resources to contain these people. Our health workers aren't equipped to deal with some of the results they have to see. And then there's ecstasy, the synthetics and the party drugs, which is another of the drugs that our young people ask me to talk about. There's a wide range of substances that fall into this category, and they have very differing effects. Some are very dangerous, some not so dangerous. But one of the greatest problems you'll find with the party drugs is that you don't know what you're getting. Somebody may sell you what you think is an ecstasy tablet, but the reality is that you don't know what's in it. It may contain no ecstasy at all. It may contain something else that's far more dangerous. It may be cut or mixed with laundry powder or any other things. So you just don't know what you're getting. It's a Russian roulette, and there's no way to quickly identify what's in them. But of course, let's come to the Adventist drug of choice. Let me talk about that. How many of you needed a coffee before you came out this morning? Caffeine is used to help us feel more alert and active, often to help us function better, to get through a long day when we haven't had enough sleep the night before. But caffeine poisoning certainly does occur, and there are some negative effects that are associated with using caffeine. And if you've ever experienced this when you haven't been able to get your cup of coffee, there's a good chance that you've actually developed a bit of a dependence to caffeine. So let's have a look at what caffeine is in. Here's just a small list. This is an Australian list. I saw lots of other lists that were American, so I rejected using them. Now remember, a soft drink such as Coke doesn't usually get sold in 100ml serves. A can of Coke, or any other soft drink, will get sold in a serve that's usually about 375 mils. So you're looking at almost 4 times that amount, almost 40 milligrams of caffeine in a can of Coke. A lot more if you happen to be an energy drinks user. And if you're a coffee drinker, you like your cappuccino, you're probably looking at about 100 milligrams of caffeine. And of course chocolate. We all talk about the caffeine in chocolate. That's the sort of figure you're looking at. In every 100 grams of chocolate, you'll find that there's about 20 milligrams or 60 milligrams, depending on the sort of chocolate that you're eating. But is this a problem? A little bit of caffeine, is it a problem? How much is too much? It's generally considered, the research is showing us, because I certainly don't see lots of people going into rehab for caffeine. So is it a problem? Less than 600 milligrams of caffeine a day is not generally considered to be particularly harmful. That's about 3 espresso coffees. But we do know that you'll begin to develop an addiction or a dependence on caffeine at the intake of about 100 milligrams a day. It's not a lot. A cappuccino, a couple of blocks of chocolate, it does 100 milligrams. It doesn't take a lot to consume that amount. We do know that it is toxic. Caffeine is toxic in high doses. If you drank 80 cups of strong coffee in a row, you'd probably die. Just like if your children were to drink 12 energy drinks in a row, they would probably die. And that's an area of particular concern for our children and our young people. Often they have built no tolerance of caffeine. And then they start drinking energy drinks. And they might not just drink 1 can, they might drink a couple of cans. And often it will leave them in a jittery sort of state because they're not used to that level of caffeine, and it is causing them a problem. So monitor, particularly amongst our younger people, energy drinks. But let's get practical. I've probably filled you up with lots of numbers and figures and charts, and I know it's a bit overwhelming sometimes when you start talking about this stuff. How does this apply in our lives, in what we do on a day-to-day basis? Now, teens, entering a time of life when you're likely to start to come into contact with some of these things. Now, I'm sure your parents would love you to be able to say, no, I don't drink. But it's not always that easy. When you're out with your friends and everybody else is drinking, it's not always easy to just go, no, I don't drink. A colleague of mine, Paul Dillon, does a lot of work in schools with young people, and he's drawn up this list. He calls them the get out of jail clauses. You know, when you don't want to drink, but everybody else around you is drinking, and you don't want to be the wowser who doesn't drink. So here's a list of a few responses that have been suggested as ways you can go, no, I don't want to drink, but it makes sense and it can be accepted by your friends. I'm not telling you to lie, but maybe there's one or two responses in there that might fit for you. Paul tells me the story of a couple of young men, high school boys in senior high school, who live in a small country town in New South Wales. They're members of the local football team. And when you live in a small country town, often there's not a lot to do socially. So every Saturday night, they'd get and hang out with their friends, and they'd find themselves drinking because there was nothing else to do. And they'd been doing this for a couple of years. But they were over it. They were ready to move on. But, you know, what else do you do? My mates are all drinking. I want to hang with my mates. Everybody's drinking. So they struck on the idea of approaching their football coach and saying, would you be willing to move football training to Sunday morning? They didn't tell him why they wanted him to move it, just that they thought it would be a good idea if football training got moved to Sunday morning. Coach was a bit not sure about this, but he said, okay, I'll ask the team. And much to his surprise, most of the rest of the team went, yeah, it's a great idea, happy to do a Sunday morning football training. These two young men, simply by being a little bit creative, a little bit innovative, changed the culture of their particular social circle. Because no longer could they go out on Saturday night and everybody get blind drunk because they had to train the next morning. So it's just worth thinking and being a little bit innovative about the way you want to approach the problem. Now, parents. As parents, we sort of hope my kids are going to be okay, I'll raise them well and they won't touch drugs. And as Adventists, we've got it pretty lucky in many ways. We don't drink, we don't tend to do drugs. We give our kids a good role model. We send them to Pathfinders, we get them involved in lots of outdoor activity. Generally, we are role models of a fairly good and healthy lifestyle. And I will always be thankful that I was raised an Adventist because it showed me that I can enjoy life without drinking. And that's not an option that many kids in Australia actually get. In a society where we use alcohol to celebrate everything from births to deaths and everything in between, where a social occasion automatically comes with alcohol, not many kids grow up knowing that you don't have to have alcohol to have a good time. So I'll always be thankful for that. But parents, it's all about relationship. How you communicate with your kids, the relationship you have with them will very much impact the way they use drugs and alcohol. And a word of warning, hopefully it's not the way it is today, but certainly when I was growing up, there were many Adventist homes where the rule was laid down with a very strict rod, where there was very strict discipline, and as a church, we lost many of our kids. Homes where there is strict discipline and conflict between parent and child, there is much risk there of harmful behaviours, as there are in homes where teenage drinking is allowed and recognised. So we're looking for the middle ground, the middle road, in the way we work with our young people. But how to recognise use? I know this is one that a lot of parents have said to me, how would I know they're using? I once had a parent tell me a story about how their garden hose kept getting shorter. They couldn't work out why. And if you don't know, I won't tell you. But these are some of the characteristics you might want to look out for or to be aware of. And this goes for young people as well. If you've got a friend you're worried about, you might want to go through this mental checklist and see how they're sitting on these things as to whether you think they may have a concern with drugs. But please, don't jump to conclusions. Being moody can be part of being a teenager. Dropping out of school or having problems at school, there could be lots of reasons. Changing your friends, that happens too. Any of these symptoms or signs don't automatically mean drug use. There could be lots of other reasons. It's important that you talk to your young people and communicate with your young people and stay in touch with what's happening in their lives. This is an interesting slide that just came out very recently. It's a little bit... So we tend to think, if I stay sober, not addicted. Or if I've got an addiction problem, I'll be sober and everything will be okay. There is a line of thinking happening now that it's all about the relationship. People who are most likely to develop problems with drug and alcohol and who have addiction problems are often alienated. They're feeling disconnected in some way from their community, from the people around them. As a community, it's our place to be open and loving, to open our arms and to ensure that our young people and everybody around us is treated with compassion and respect, that they feel part of who we are, that they're not alienated. One of the greatest problems I see amongst the drug users that I've worked with is that they already have a very low self-esteem. And we have a stereotype as a society. If you're a drug user, there's a certain stigma attached to it if you've got problems with drugs. When you're already suffering from a low self-esteem, you don't need everybody else's judgment on you. And just to further make that point, and I'm certainly not saying that everybody who becomes or develops a drug problem has got a traumatic past, but we do know that there is a significant link between childhood trauma and addiction. It's stronger than obesity and diabetes. Two-thirds of people who report having a dependence on drugs also report they were abused as children. We need to look after our children. Treat them with the love and respect that God gave. And that's where I want to finish today. The greatest commandment that God gave us is that we serve our community. I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, just as I, God, have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. So it's all about how we serve our community, how we hold our family, how we hold our children to us. And just in closing, I know I had a woman that I grew up with who attended church with me and whose son sadly suicided a couple of years ago after drug use, as a result of drug use. When I said to her, I'm going to be talking to my church about drugs, she said to me, one of the greatest difficulties I had is that people in the church didn't understand me. They didn't know what I was going through. They judged me. I didn't feel that it was a safe place. So let's make our church a safe place. And if you do know of someone who is looking for help around their drug use, if you want further information about drugs, here are a few of the places that I'd suggest that you look at and talk to. You know, I have heard ministers stand in the pulpit and say, if you've got an addiction problem, you just need to spend more time in the Bible, you just need to spend time with God. You know, and I've met people who've done that and have solved their problems. I've met people who are very bitter after trying that experience. Recovery from addiction is very possible. It happens in a number of ways, and it will depend on the individual. There are many paths out of addiction. We need to offer people the opportunity to resolve their drug problems or the issues they might be having by putting them in touch with various places who might help.